So my name is Kate. I am a professor here at CQUniversity. I am the first presenter in this session. So while Cherie gets herself sorted technically, I am happy to kick off and then time myself. So I believe that we have 15 minutes to Michael. I'll let you wave at me madly if I'm or send me a message if I'm starting to run late. So I'll share my screen. So welcome everybody to our educational technology section. I am presenting today on our journey in developing what we're calling a tertiary accredited self-paced online course, and we're calling it a TASPOC. It's not a MOOC, and I'll talk to you about why it's not a MOOC. So my presentation is really quite informal. It's a discussion about some of the findings so far. The research is covered by research ethics, and I am presenting on behalf of a team, myself, Colin, Damien, our head of course, Peter Hosie, and Noal Atkinson. And so let me talk about our story. So what are we doing? This is an MBA Leadership. So our MBA Leadership was started in 2016 as a strategic initiative and an idea to engage more people into postgraduate study on the basis that MBAs are very expensive, particularly for regional people who might be unable to attend often the residential component. So anybody who has tried to fly for a weekend from Longreach recently would know that not only on top of the $30,000 to $50,000 in costs you're spending on just the course fees alone, the cost of actually travel and engaging in that broader the team and the student body is prohibitive. So the question was, well, how do we do this? And so we developed what we're calling a hyperflexible open course. And that is an MBA. It has 12 units, or the equivalent of 12 units. You'll see there that the leadership capstone is the equivalent of 2. And the idea is, let's just make it open. You know, let's see what it looks like if we don't have terms and courses. Now, technically, we know we have to have courses, terms, because funding is, in Australia anyway, is predicated on terms. Our entire Higher Education Act is predicated on the notion of terms and funding. So we configured it in terms, but the students don't see that. They don't see that they're engaged in a term, with the exception that we have boundaries, you know, final due dates, and overall they're given 5 years to complete the course. But on a day-by-day basis, they can submit their assessment when they like, they can progress through the course as they like, and then we had to think of a way in which to support those students. You know, at the moment, as an example, we currently have nudging 190 students, and all of those students can submit assessment at any time, whenever they like, and we give them, we aim for a 3 to 5 day turnaround. Sometimes we take a little bit longer, but generally speaking, we sit on around the, you know, around that five days. And that's been working well. Since we started, we've only had 3 students withdraw for personal sort of reasons. They just decided that they actually weren't up for it. And we orient the students by, they have an orientation. So you'll see that the green on the left there is an orientation course. They come in, it shows them an example of what the course looks like, and then asks them questions about their ability to study, particularly independently. So we don't have standard courses and lectures. It's quite a unique course design. We don't have standard discussion forums. The assessment is in most ways quite traditional, but it is very self-reflective and very much driven on the premise that, or we'll actually ask the question, you know, we talk about collaborative learning, and we talk about the fact that students learn best, you know, that social constructivism, they learn best when working in groups. But the premise or the question is, well, do they work best working in groups with the course, or do we drive them to work and reflect on their group work within their workplace? So we configured it quite differently. So they're an example of what it looks like, and everything's timed. It's all AQF compliant. It's not a MOOC. You know, we kept saying, oh, it's like a MOOC. Actually, no, it's not like a MOOC at all. Really, it's a postgraduate course designed for AQF, 150 plus hours. Actually, some of them are, you'll see there, you know, 195 hours. Some of them are over, some of them are under, but overall definitely designed at that AQF level 9 graduate. So that's the overall course. So these are where our students are. So when we looked at this snapshot is cut at the 12 months. So what we did was we thought, well, what does it look like in 12 months? So at the time we had around 160 at 12 months. So it launched on the 1st of July 2018. And so we cut or did a snapshot at the 1st of July this year. And this is where our students come from. So you can see in Tennant Creek, we have a student at Tennant Creek. We've got students all around the country. Tasmania, one of my most active students are in Tasmania, and we also have clusters. So we've seen cohorts of students. You know, the Bustleton Shire Council. We've got some, you know, regional health, regional councils, regional health units, where we've got between 6, 12, and in one case more than 20 students enrolled working together. And so they engage with the courseware, but they're also engaging with the with one another while they're learning. So what that said to us was it was kind of working. It was in fact enabling people in regional areas who may otherwise not be able to attend or come or engage with MBA study. It was in fact working in terms of geographical perspective. So, and Michael said surprisingly few out west in Queensland. Yeah, actually, we still have questions about that, and in terms of, you know, things like cost. You know, clearly the drought has a huge impact, and also the fact that NBN, you know, like access to telecommunication would be an issue, we believe. So this is just some data, some sort of rough data that we've started. So as an example, the idea was that, well, it was an open qualification. You know, we've definitely got entry requirements. The students need to have been working. They need to have some form of experience to be able to enter the course, but they certainly don't need the 10, 15 years executive experience to entry. It was decided that really aiming more at the middle manager. What we think we were surprised about is the fact that we actually didn't have that many people who didn't have prior qualifications. So you'll see we had 2 cohorts. We have a pilot cohort, so we tested the concept on 58 pilot students. It's quite a large pilot, but we were very concerned it's an extremely new model in postgraduate study. And then since then we've had 97, and now far more than that. We're up to about 140. So, but we had, you know, most had prior undergrad and postgrad qualifications, but we have some who've got prior vocational qualifications, and we have just a few who've had no prior qualifications, and those students had extensive, what's the word, professional experience. So that's been an interesting journey for us. And also, how do we cater for those students in onboarding them to set them up for success? What we can see is the non-pilot student enrolment trends. So we can see that we've started to build. December was a large cohort where we had a cohort, and then we ended up May, June. So that trajectory has now stayed steady. We're getting fairly steady applications, and they can enroll. You know, you could all decide, oh, that looks like a great idea, and technically you could be enrolled and start your study, you know, by 6 o'clock tonight if you had everything organised. So that's certainly been something that our students seem to have enjoyed the opportunity for. Unit purchase trend, that is, students have got the opportunity to buy in bulk, so they can buy the whole course in bulk. It is an extremely cheap degree, so that was $7,000 for the whole course, because we've cut away the things that cost us the most, such as, you know, monitoring a discussion board, which we worked out was around $12,000 to $15,000 at ASPRO level for a term. So when you cut away those costs, you're starting to realise actually where you can possibly you know, offer something for less, but then how else do you support students? So we've had to completely redevise the way we support students, and again, it's a very new model. But what's been interesting, that despite the bulk cost, most students, 3/4 of them, do in fact buy in purchase, noting that the price of the degree is now going to go up. So student progression, how are they going? So that's the biggest question we've been asked is, well, if they're not given any deadlines, what are they doing? Like, how do they progress? So what we found is that the non-pilot students are, obviously they make better progress than the pilots. So pilot students were charged less. There appears to be a link between what they were charged and their commitment to study. So we're working through that. more than, so 35% of the non-pilot students had completed or started to complete assessment within that first year, noting some of them had only just been enrolled. There were 225 individual assessments submitted, noting also that we've seen a significant increase just in the last couple of weeks. Don't know whether everybody suddenly got bored on school holidays, but the number of assessments suddenly coming in is really starting to ramp up. And then proportion of days active on the learning management system, which is in fact Moodle, you can see that the non-pilot students are clearly more active than the pilot. And then we can also see a difference between the assessment results of the pilot and the non-pilot. And these are, the numbers are different there because it's working on the assessed work or the submitted work. So we can see that the pilot students have an average assessment result that is 1 grade higher than the non-pilot student. At the moment, we haven't then drilled down into that data, but it looks like the pilot cohort is the more educated. Most of those were internal staff and selected cohorts. So those were already high level quals at this stage, it appears. And then this final one here is the assessment item performance. So one of the questions we got asked is, well, how do you manage the course? So we actually look at this course as a course level, not unit level. And this table here illustrates, you know, an example of what we might look at. So we've looked at all these assessment items. We can look at the average results. So we see that those average results can range from a pass through to for assessment item D, there is a 76, 6%. So the question there that the course team then looks at is assessment item T too easy and is assessment item A too hard? And those are the conversations that we have. And in those instances, assessment item D is a reflective piece where students really, really engage. You can see that they engage. So that might equate to the higher result there, that they're interested because it's authentic. Assessment item A is an accounting subject, but the question then was, is that too hard? Yes. And so when we actually drilled into it, there were in fact issues with the rubric. Those students were remarked, they got a higher grade, and it was really the fact that the rubric wasn't reflective of the overall grade. So overall, where we are at the stage of continuing to monitor the progress. We are pretty happy. We can see that some students just don't do anything for 3 months and then suddenly do 2 weeks where they just work, you know, hard at it. We've got a couple of students who are about to graduate in the next, certainly before Christmas, we'll have 2 or 3 graduates, and those students have made very steady progress. You know, one of them clearly, you know, every night, I don't know what he does, but every night sort of between 3 and, you know, 6 o'clock in the morning, he's actually cracking away. We can see that he's, you know, working through his materials, might be on night shift somewhere. So we've got a new way of managing the cohort. The students have reflected very positively on the fact that they feel like they know the staff more, ironically enough, even though they are working more independently than they have. And the next stage is to actually then go out to the students and see, you know, how they feel about their study journey. One of the things anecdotally we've heard back is that it's harder than they thought. Many of them I think they thought, oh, well, it's a cheap degree, it's not going to be a real degree, therefore I'll just go in and give it a crack. And in fact it is.
15 minutes, Kate, 15 minutes.
Okay, so you know, they've found it harder than they want. So that's it from me. If you have any questions. Are we doing questions now, or are we going to...
Can I just check if Cherie, are you online? Okay, well, let me, in Cherie's absence, she's had some technical problems, so I will continue to facilitate. Kate, thank you very much for starting off. Let's keep the questions to the end, if you don't mind. That seems to be the practice in the earlier ones. So I might ask the second author and presenter, and I'm sorry I don't have the program in front of me, but I might just ask the second author and presenter to identify, introduce themselves, and perhaps share their PowerPoint screen, and we'll kick off in number 2.
So I am here today to talk to you a little bit about something I've been raving on about for years and years, which is this idea of a thing called pedagogy before technology. And I'm going to be really honest with you up front. This is predominantly a sales pitch for me, really. It is an opportunity for me to convince you that you should be thinking about your pedagogical problems in your classroom before you think about their technology, rather than the other way around. And I say that in front of lots of classrooms, predominantly of primary school and high school teachers. And those primary school and high school teachers, they always roll their eyes and they go, of course we're thinking about the pedagogy first, we're teachers. And then I remind them how often they would have a principal or a head of department or a technology guy come along and say, look at this great new technology that we found. Apple has convinced us that we should all be using iPads, or Microsoft has convinced us that we should all be using mixed reality. And they buy the technology and then they say to the teachers, what are you going to use this for in your classroom? And the teachers at that point, when I'm presenting them, always roll their eyes and kind of go, yeah, okay, you're right. That happens a lot. And I think it happens a lot in university. We don't necessarily have the head of department or the head of course doing that to us, but we certainly have lots of examples of people standing up and talking about brand new, exciting, interesting technology. And it is really exciting, but we just need to be really careful that when we think about the technology, we don't start with the technology. Instead, we start with the pedagogy. And so here's this first slide, just gives you a bit of that. And the workshops I run for school teachers are called the Weaving Technology into the Fabric of the Classroom workshops. And so this presentation, in a way, is sort of a very abridged version of what I give the K-12 teachers. And predominantly, this presentation is going to talk about this model, the Pedagogy Before Technology model. And the Pedagogy Before Technology model is a design-based research model, but it doesn't have to be research. You could, if you'd like, just apply PBT and just get something working in your classroom and not do any research at all if you wanted to. But it does fit very well into the DBR model, design-based research model. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about design science or design science research, which is similar, a little bit different, in that it does have this mechanism where you start with the practical problems. You develop a set of solutions, you evaluate and test those solutions, and then you document and reflect to produce a set of design principles. And then the important thing is you loop back around. So once you've had an opportunity, in our case, to try the technology in your class and to see how it works, then you go back and you evaluate again what other things you might change, how you might improve your classroom practice using that technology to get better results out of it. But the important thing is that the technology is last. And if we look at this figure, I always point out that even though this cog at the bottom, how can technology help, is the biggest cog, it is also the last cog. We should start by thinking about what the problem is. We should then think about how we can solve the problem. And then finally, we should think about how the technology can help us. And I always say to people that I know I'm a technology guy, and I know that I am, first and foremost tech. But even in my presentations, I say that if the technology doesn't make sense, don't use the technology. If you work out the problem and you determine the best way to solve the problem is with, wooden blocks, or blue tack and spaghetti, or whatever, whatever problem you're trying to solve, if that's the best way to solve the problem, role playing, then do that. Forget about mixed reality, forget about artificial intelligence, and focus on the thing that'll actually solve your problem. And some people sometimes go, wow, a technology guy is saying that, and that's, true. I am a tech guy, and I'd love you to use the tech, and I think tech can solve a lot of the problems, but I don't necessarily think tech is the solution for all of our problems. And so predominantly this presentation is a pitch to use the Pedagogy Before Technology model, is for you to narrow down and think about what problems you have in your classroom, and then finally think about how the technology can help. And of course, when you get to this step, if you go, well, what tech is there? There's lots of great resources in the university that can help you with that. And this is a great place for me to plug the virtual, augmented and mixed reality community of practice in the university. And the VAM community of practice will teach you all about how to use virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality in your classroom. So if you've got a problem you think can be solved with virtual reality or augmented reality, go and talk to Jim or go and talk to Daryl, and they'll help you with that. But what I'm going to do to sort of cement this for you is I'm going to give you a little case study. And apologies if you've heard this case study before. It is the paramedic science case study that I always use as an example. But what I am going to do is I'll give you this case study just really briefly, so that you can see how it actually works in practice.
A state-of-the-art invention is allowing paramedic students to practice life-saving procedures in the comfort of their own homes. 2 Queensland universities have collaborated to create and build the cost-effective equipment using 3D technology.
It's no game, but doctors and nurses for grown-ups.
Insert blade.
The smartphone application gives paramedic students a step-by-step guide to removing foreign items stuck in patients' throat.
So it's not a skill that we use every single day, but it is a skill, as you can imagine, that if you do need to use it, you need to be competent and confident that you can do the skill properly.
The lightweight tools are made by 3D printers. Each kit costs around 20 cents, about 99% cheaper than the real steel.
Well, you can never truly compare it to real life. Obviously, you've got a patient and you've got the situation, but it still helps to have that muscle memory of doing the skill.
The app was designed to give hundreds of distance education students more exposure to the procedure and better spatial awareness.
Having the ability to, at least see a laryngoscope and a McGill's forceps and see what they like and just step through the process is huge, because these guys only really get hands-on when they come to residential for a week.
The technology was a joint creation between CQU paramedicine experts and Bond University's gadget gurus.
And they're just as interested in us to see how it works and can it be applied to other courses.
Even when I started 9 years ago, this would be foreign, unheard of. Even university was foreign, unheard of. So just the leaps and bounds paramedic science has had is massive.
Tom Hartley, 7 News.
There we go. So this, I say apologies if you've seen this before, because this is a study that we did a few years ago. It's from 2014 is actually when we started. So what's it, 5 years ago now? And we worked on it over several years and we refined it over time. But I always like to cast back to when we started in this study, because I think that really was the start of this PBT model, the Pedagogy Before Technology model, because we knew we wanted to do some work and we knew we probably wanted to do it with some sort of mixed reality, some sort of augmented or virtual reality. I did some work with James Burt at Bond University, so we kind of knew that we wanted to do something with the tech. But we realised even back then, 5 years ago, that there needed to be a pedagogical base for this work. And so we went to the paramedics, we went to the, actually went to the School of Medical and Applied Sciences at the time, and said, we've got this thing we want to try. Have you got some people that might have a pedagogical problem? And they said, yeah, look, the paramedics, and in particular this paramedic that's on screen now, Emma Moore, she might have something for you that might help, that might fit with what you're doing. And I think she does have some issues with training the paramedic students with skills. And so we went, okay, well, let's go and have a chat to Emma. And we went and talked to Emma, and Emma came back and said, yeah, actually, we really do have trouble with training the students about the skills. And she gave us this feedback, and this feedback is from the course evaluations at the time, unit evaluations now, from the students saying that they had issues learning the skills. And the reason they had issues learning the skills is because they were distance students. They didn't get an opportunity to practice these skills before the residential school. And they were clear about it in the evaluations. It was great that we went and we looked, and she was able to say, yeah, I have this pedagogical problem. And we said to her, do you have any evidence? And she said, yeah, look, here's some feedback they gave us in the evaluations. Things like distance students are at a severe disadvantage. There should be a way for us to actually get more time doing skills. You can read about the skills, but it's impossible to get feedback and to know if you're doing it right. And then one of the students even gave us a hint. He said, would there be any software or equipment that could at least go through the motions of doing the skills? And so even though, and I'm always first to admit that we had started with an idea of what technology we wanted to use, we very much so were able to identify that there was a problem here, a very specific problem that had a very specific thing that the students were complaining about. When you apply the model, I want you to think about that. It needs to be small, it needs to be achievable, it needs to be something you can address. And then we said to Emma, okay, well, if you had a magic wand, if you could do anything that you wanted to do, what would you do to these students? And she said, I would send every one of these students one of those mannequin dummies in the left-hand corner of the slide there, along with the metal tools, and then they could practice as much as they wanted. And we went, well, okay, that's really interesting.
10 minutes, Michael, 10 minutes.
No problem, thank you. We said, we can probably do that for you. We can probably help you with that. And so we said, why don't we 3D print some tools, give the students those tools, and then why don't we make an app that they can use to actually see the mannequin head and practice the skills. It's not the same as sending them the mannequin head. And as we went along, a lot of the revisions we've done in the intervening years have been to try and make it more realistic. But at the very least, it will give them an opportunity to practice and to work with that mannequin head. And in order to get them to see the app, because we're talking about 2014, we stuck it in this sort of ghetto hat mount thing. We told them to buy a baseball cap. We sent them these little mounts and they mounted their phone in front of their head. And that allowed them to have both hands free because they had to operate both the scope and the forceps. And then we built this game and we made it free for all the students to download. And what do you know? It worked pretty well. We sent it away to the students. And the students enjoyed using the app and they gave us some really good feedback on using the app. And they also told us some things that we hadn't considered. And there's lots of stuff I could talk about here, but I've only got a few minutes left. But things like if you have a view like the one on the right-hand side, you can see that the arm of the participant, the person that's doing the skill, on the bottom left-hand side there, if I wiggle my mouse, you might see it come up here, goes behind the patient's head. That's not realistic because it would actually go in front of the patient's head, but we have no way of knowing whether it should be behind or in front of the mannequin head. And so we stick it behind just so that they can see what's going on better. But for them, that was less realistic. And they gave us some feedback about that. They gave us feedback about a bunch of other things as well. And if we look on this slide, we can see that kind of feedback. They said, my hand seems to pass by the simulated airways mannequin. I spent too much time focusing on the markers and not on the tools. If you look back at this slide, you can see these big colorful markers, which actually got in the way for students. And they would sometimes get frustrated. However, they did say they really enjoyed practicing the skills when they were at home. They really enjoyed the extra practice that they got. They really enjoyed just holding the tools in their hand, just the plastic tools in their hand, because you've got to remember the distance students never get a chance to actually use those. And so then on this first trial, we actually found that even though the students liked it, there was not a statistical significant difference. But then as per the DBR model, we looped back around, we made those modifications that they asked us to. One of the modifications was getting rid of the really weird ghetto hat mount and getting something that was a bit better, a bit more stereoscopic. And then in the second round of doing this test, we actually did find a statistically significant difference. So in essence, the students that used the app when they were at home before they came to the residential school were better paramedics when they got to the residential school. And that's what we were trying to achieve, because ultimately that allowed us to address that initial feedback that we got about the problem. And so overall, I'm going to go backwards and cheat a little bit. I want you to remember the model.
To conclude, Michael, if you wouldn't mind.
What's that, sorry?
Ask you to conclude if you wouldn't mind.
No probs. So this model here is the model I want to sell to you, the Pedagogy Before Technology model. Remember the 3 stages. What is the problem? How can I solve that problem? And how can technology help? If you want to know more about it, or you want to talk to me a little bit more, then please go and have a look at the Create Lab website. It's got some more details on PBT and how it works. Mixed reality research is where all of those tools are for paramedics. You can download them for free if you'd like. And I will say that if you are an if you're a vet staff member and you're listening to this, then in about 3 weeks, we are doing a presentation called the Education, Technology and Innovation Boot Camp for vet teachers. That's in North Rockhampton. It's on the 25th of October, and we will be spending a bit more time working through this model, working through this process of putting pedagogy before technology, specifically for vet teachers, but in your specific context.
Right, thank you very much.
I've got into my pocket, 10 seconds to go, so I think I did okay. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's fantastic. I must admit, I reflect on whether it's the chicken or the egg, and I caught you talking about swapping both of those. So I think you've given us plenty of room for thought, and I think most of us would very much appreciate that. So thank you. Folks, questions at the end, of course, and I hope you're saving those up, because I noticed through the chat room there's plenty of great questions, so please save those up. We're going to have time at the end to do that. I'd like to invite Tasadduq Imam and perhaps his colleagues Stephen Boyd and Garrick Small, and they're going to talk to us about serious games and digital tools. So are you online there, Tasadduq? Or is it Stephen? Are you giving the presentation?
I'm actually going to be the first one talking, but we're just going to quickly check if we can have Tasadduq load the slides. Otherwise, I'll take over from my end.
All right, Steve. Well, I'll leave you to start. That's okay with you. And have you got your PowerPoint there?
Sure. I'll go through with my one now.
All right, and just share the screen for all this, and then away you go. And thank you very much.
No worries. Just checking to see if you can see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks very much for having us. We do have 3 presenters today, and I'll do a bit more of an introduction in a moment. Also, thank you very much, Michael, for that presentation before, because that provides a really good lead into, I guess, part of our proposals here in our discussion too. So today we're really talking about the focuses on the finance and property disciplines, which the 3 presenters are from. In both disciplines, we have this real focus on practical decision-making, which in many cases is a real attraction of the students that we have enrolled. The trouble is that often with that focus on this practical decision-making, there's often, I guess, new skills and specialised parts of maths that students do need to go along and adopt and get stuck into. This can often lead to a load of reading. And for those students, I guess, who are looking at a practical destination in their pathway, it can be quite a significant barrier to these studies, having this significant cognitive load. And textbooks and others aren't really well designed to, I guess, accommodate these students and a lot of their learnings. So if I were to put this in a really short sense, and Tasadduq will have a moment to take this one a little bit further, it does mean that a lot of our students may find themselves adopting different strategies to learn, and especially around their assessments. Whether they go down a pathway towards rote learning, either way, they often adopt approaches which are not as deep as we would like to go along and see them engage in. So that brings us to the idea of looking into the role of educational games and innovation digital tools to see what we can get out of those. So that brings me to my first part here, which is going to be about designing serious games. And then when we finish off that discussion, I'm going to go and hand over to Tasadduq, who's going to discuss digital tools, cognitive load reduction literature, and also then we're handing over to Garrick, who will also consider other issues to consider and conclusions. So firstly, these are actually a few of my students actually working on a particular game that relates to, I guess, part of our discussions today. The game which I'd like to share first off is, it goes back to exactly what Michael was talking before, was this idea of how we go through, I guess, this design-based process, and whether we look into the gap, the need, the problem, and how we go along and develop the solution. For the development of this particular game and a couple of others in a suite, the process I used was design science, which was briefly introduced and had that focus towards problems, defining objectives, design, demonstration, evaluation, and so on. So that was pretty much the approach that was used, but it was the 2 parts that I'm hoping to discuss and talk about was more around that problem and also some emerging findings from the evaluation. You can find far more information in some of the references that we've provided. So the first thing I wanted to share was one of the interesting elements of the problem. And I guess that's also understanding the environment that you're in and what people have done before. It took me quite a while in my research before I found out that I was about 100 years late on this journey. I found a particular Quaker, Lizzie Maggie, who published in a single text review in 1902 about a game that she designed. It was called The Landlord's Game. And I'll just take a few words out of her own direction as what she saw her game to provide. So this is Lizzie Maggie's words. Let the children once see clearly the gross injustice of our present land system, and when they grow up, if they're allowed to develop naturally, the evil will soon be remedied. This passage, while it's very directed towards her particular goal, for me as a researcher, fit the descriptions of what I was looking at as a serious game. It was clearly designed for a specific intent. Where this game went, for those of you playing ahead a little bit here, this actually did turn into the world's most popular board game. It turned into Monopoly, got stolen by a few people, got adulterated by higher education people like us, and ultimately turned into something that was very different to what Lizzie had initially conceived, but in that same breath, it also has been, I guess, a part of many people's learning journey. So that was one of the most important things that I found in the problem and defining the objectives, was that there were interesting ideas out there around games like this that could be so engaging that everybody loses except for one, yet still they can flourish in a depression. So there was a lot more to look into. Fast forward the research which I was looking into serious games, one of the serious games that I designed was, I guess, taken a little bit further in its evaluation stage. And we started to look quite significantly into the associations between enjoyment and the perception of learning. And for this one particular game, we actually found quite a significant association between that, between enjoyment and the perception of learning. This is actually quite important because the relationship between achievement, measured by how many scores or how many points somebody gets, and the respondent's perception of enjoyment was still present, but wasn't as significant as that first relationship between enjoyment and the perception of learning. It also goes further to say that there's also the emerging findings that this does support a deeper relationship between play and learning, one where competition and other gameplay attributes are more effective in engagement than just point scoring or rewarding. And that provides a really significant foundation for a deeper level of research into serious games. So I'm more than happy to speak about this, I guess, in questions later on, but it's about this point of time that I'd like to go along and present over to Tasadduq if he's up and running, for him to go along and present on digital tools and cognitive load reduction literature.
Okay, so regarding finance, we have a different challenge here in CQ. Like one of the things we have in the finance discipline is that the students come up from many different programs, and they differ in study modes, numerical skills, and mathematics, and the textbooks are highly mathematical. So what we try to say always that we need to incorporate digital tools and including serious games. And what I have found out over my experience of teaching finance courses for quite a long time is that there is a need for some other approaches with respect to the digital tools. So for example, some of the things that I use in my courses include customized slides and automated quizzes and interactive videos. So by this, what I mean is that the slides that the textbook publishers often promote, these often are highly technical, and many of the students do not have the numerical skills to even understand the basic concepts. So what I have found out useful is that if I incorporate some basic mathematical concepts, try to explain in layman ideas or layman terms, which are not available in the textbooks. So I found that the students generally like that sort of incorporation and addition, as well as trying to incorporate new things, including new recent research in a very easily understandable way, rather than presenting as formulas. And on top of that, making the slides interactive as well. So talking of something and then asking whether they have reflected on those aspects. In respect to interactive videos, I often use the Camtasia as well as the Wacom templates and try to show different ways of solving maths and other things. And as regards to automated quizzes, what I meant to say is that I try to provide a feedback that they get automatically as soon as they respond to those different quiz questions. Now, I had a screenshot concerning this, but unfortunately I can't share it at the moment. But the other things which we are also developing in the finance side are the games. So the thing that I like to promote here or try to sell here is something similar to just my previous presentation as well, that we do have a plethora of digital tools that we can use, but just using the tools are not enough. So all these things that I have told here, these are designed based on some learning theory in consideration, especially reducing cognitive load and improving transactional presence. And there is also an ongoing research in which I am involved, which shows that students prefer a blended approach rather than just online learning or just on-campus learning. So this was a research, this was a survey done in our accounting discipline.
10 minutes.
And the outcomes are showing that.
10 minutes.
And lastly, the thing that I would like to show are some of the outcomes that I have found out based on those approaches. Is that, as you can see, the student feedback has generally been good, and there have also been qualitative comments supporting that. So the key idea is just having tools are not enough, but we need to incorporate or supplement it with other learning theory approaches. So I would hand over to Garrick.
Great. Thanks very much, Tasadduq. What I want to do is round off this presentation by looking at 4 points or take-home ideas that are important when designing educational games and using sort of more innovative technologies. And I'm going to be looking specifically at games. When Stephen was looking at Monopoly, one of the nice things about the game is that it does accurately parallel real life to a surprising degree. Whereas a number of games which have been incorporated for educational purposes tend to twist reality a little bit to make it easier to, achieve in a classroom, or to fudge a particular economic theory which just might not happen to work in the real world. And so while games are really useful, their real world, truth mapping, if you like, is really important. The second issue has to do with really a pedagogical issue, but it's also relevant when you're using the games as the basis for educational research, or even research related to your particular field. And that is, do the players have the necessary skills? If we're, for instance, taking finance students and sitting in front of something which simulates something like the stock exchange, do they have the understanding of the way that stocks and bonds work, or futures, or whatever it is, to be able to really engage in the game? And that's an important issue. Really, it means that you have to prep the students before they do the experience, rather than just kind of throw them in at the deep end. The third point is probably the most important. It goes back to one of my favourite books, comes from 1986, and a number of you have probably read it. Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, which I think is a classic in this area, because he said that basically a community's dominant form of public communication influences the way we think, and he was complaining that television had actually dumbed down education. And we're in some ways are seeing this in a lot of innovations today. We're using technology probably more, well, if we're really honest about it, sometimes more as an entertainment for the class than actual education. So we need to have clear, defensible learning objectives. That's really should be the starting point. And I think, as Michael was saying earlier, you really got to put the pedagogy first. The last is scalability. By this, I mean, there are a lot of potentials with these things, and you do see a lot of publications that are in their disciplines, not in terms of teaching methods, but rather in terms of revealing the complications of the way people behave. We see this a lot in economics and finance. And so a well-designed game can give you very powerful data, really a social psychological experiment, which can have lots of research applications, major scalability application. The third is the application to culturally diverse populations. I found this with a game that I was running, and I had the opportunity to run it in Fiji, Singapore, and Australia. And the behavior was very different between Fijian students who had very strong customary values and background, if you like, a natural indigenisation, compared to the people in Singapore, compared to the people in Australia. And so the capacity to use games which might appear to be sort of dry, how does the finance industry work, or the property markets or whatever, can actually give us insights into a lot more than their parent discipline. And so with that, I think we will finish up. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Garrick and Tasadduq and Stephen. That's a great follow-on from the previous two talks, so that's fantastic. And we're certainly going on time, which is great. There'll be plenty of time then for questions at the end. I'd like now.
Michael, Joe here. So Ritesh and I supervise Darren Turnbull, who is the fourth speaker.
Yeah.
And what's happened is that he's an Australian student who's living and working in China at the moment. And China have geo-blocked Zoom.
Okay.
So he can't join us, but we are prepared, and Ritesh hopefully is loading up a video that Darren did yesterday, and we're going to play a video of him talking because he cannot join us live. And he's tried again. He's just emailed me about 50 minutes ago. He's tried again. He still can't get onto Zoom. So,
okay, thank you very much, Joe. Let's see. I can see Ritesh is there in the room. So, how's it going, Ritesh? Is it going all right?
With the technology?
Ritesh, you're just muted for the moment.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. So I'm all set up. I can start playing the video.
Hey, listen, guys, that's fantastic use of technology, whether you've had a pedagogical involvement or not. All right, Ritesh,
so no need to time it. It goes for 16 minutes. So anyway, that's the way it goes.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ritesh.
Thank you. So just bear with me.
We can see that.
To see the screen, yep.
Indeed we can. Thank you. That's brilliant.
Now I need to get the
sound, yes.
Yep, just a sec.
Because my name is Darren Turnbull, and I'm recording this video from China because unfortunately I cannot access Zoom anymore. So my apologies for this. My presentation is on One LMS, 2 countries, looking at the difference between Australia and China when using learning management systems. I am a vocational education and training instructor in Ningbo, China, which is near Shanghai. I'm also an RHD student. My supervisors, Dr. Joe Luck and Dr. Ritesh Chugh, are at the presentation, and hopefully they can answer any questions you might have from what I'm about to talk about. Okay, so an LMS is, look at how they're used in Australia, compare that with China, and I've got a bit of a model that I'd like to share with you on things that we can consider when we're designing courses for use in LMS systems in Australia. So essentially, an LMS has at its core an admin function. They deal with grades, courses, comms. Comms can be asynchronous, such as emails, or synchronous, such as video conferencing, such as this online conference. Certifications, particularly important in the vet sector, that we're able to map competencies against qualifications that we issue to students. Reporting functions, these are important for students, they're important for institutional administrators, and of course instructors who have to grade the students. Finally, access controls, I think, are becoming increasingly an important element of LMSs, particularly when plagiarism raises its ugly head and we are assessing more and more our students in online environments. And so LMSs that can help us determine that the student who is taking the exam is the actual student enrolled in the course, I think, is an extremely important function. Okay. How LMSs work in an Australian context. First of all, LMSs are largely used in a blended learning environment where we have a classroom full of students and we introduce technology to assist in the teaching and learning process. And it's sort of my observation that the expectation from both instructors and the institution is that students will be self-directed when it comes to the resources and materials we give them in an LMS. This is a little bit different to the China context, which I'll come to in a moment, but largely we set up LMSs in Australia so that students can get access to the materials when they need them, and we take the role more of a facilitator than we do as a stand and deliver instructor. Aspects about learning that are important with an LMS are communication, 2 types of communication, asynchronous, for example, emails or bulletin boards or any written form of communication where we do not expect an immediate response. And the more exciting development in comms is synchronous learning, where we actually interact and connect with a student in real ways, in real time, a bit like this online conference, for example. So as the sophistication of LMSs increases, we get better technology, better bandwidth, then synchronous learning tools will become more commonplace, and then learning in an online environment will start to replicate more a classroom situation. The other aspect about my Australian experience is that LMSs have a lot of analytics, and increasingly in Australia they tend to be used to good effect. Besides the obvious grade reporting that you can get from an LMS, you can get data on student access. How much time did a student spend on LMS? What particular areas did they access? And how long did they spend in those particular areas? And we can use analytics to help us determine those students at risk and then come up with some intervention strategies that can assist learners become more successful in their learning journey, particularly when it comes to using tools that are available in LMS environments. Lastly, in Australia, there has been a big push to incorporate social media. I think that comes from the fact that a lot of the communication tools are a bit chunky in both proprietary and open source LMSs. And the more that we can engage students in their own familiar social media spaces, such as Facebook or Twitter, for example, and use those to good effect in conjunction with the LMSs that we use, I think the more richer communication and richer connections we're going to have with our students. So that's something that is taking off in China as well. And I'll get more to that in a moment because social media is a little bit different in China. But that's sort of an exciting development in the area of LMSs that I think is going to make learning management systems and their incorporation into Australia in education much more exciting for our students. Okay, on to China. In the way that LMSs are used in China, but also some important differences. Right in the middle there, I've got a graphic called CQUX. I put that there just to point out that a lot of the proprietary systems in China are actually developed within the country and very different corporations to what you find in the West. CQUX is one of the biggest ones, maybe the biggest in China, and they do a lot of development work in the LMS space, particularly for very large systems that deal with tens of thousands of users in completely online environments. And it's sort of my observation, particularly in the place where I'm working, that LMSs tend to be more prevalent in completely online learning environments rather than being incorporated as a tool in blended learning. That's sort of an observation, and I'd be really happy to discuss any differences that people might have about that observation. The other thing that I think is very different in China, at least the place that I work, is that students expect direction from the instructor as to how to use an LMS. I don't mean things like logging on, I mean what resources to use when them, when to study, how much time they should spend. This is very much different to the Australian approach, where we expect in Australia that students will manage their own learning and then access those resources they need to get through the material at their own pace. In China, students tend to work together in tandem under the direction of a centrally controlled instructor. Very much different to the Australian experience. Again, going on from that point, a lot of the teaching, the way the classroom's set up, the physical layout, for example, the expectation of how an LMS used is based on a teacher-centered model, where the teacher's in the front of the classroom and the students often are perceived as being the passive learner. I'm not sure that's actually a correct stereotype, but that's certainly the perception that many people have when they're first confronted with the way the teaching is done in China. Social media. Social media is different to Australian social media. Well, any Western social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and even Zoom now are explicitly banned, so they have their own platforms here. WeChat, probably one of the most important WeChat would sort of be a hybrid between Facebook and Twitter, I think, in terms of its functionality. But there's some exciting developments there, and many instructors, myself included, are starting to incorporate WeChat as a communication tool that can aid in student learning. For example, I have a group of learners, and we create a WeChat group account where we communicate regularly with each other. A lot of the times they're sort of mundane things like timetabling issues or scheduling issues, such as when an assessment's going to be held. Other times, though, they're more issues related to learning points as well that maybe the group want to address. So just like Australia, WeChat, which is a representative social media tool here in China, becoming much more integrated into LMS use. Now, group learning. This is a major difference, again, with Australia. I feel that in the vet sector, well, even in the university sector as well, there's a focus on individual learning, or if you want to put it another way, in the flipped classroom approach, where the student's in control of their own learning and we facilitate. And here in China, there's very much more group work that takes place, or there seems to be an affinity of students to group together when they're tackling a learning problem. And if you look at groups in China, they're much more homogeneous than they are in Australia. And so the way that I sort of structure my assessments in a learning management system is to develop group work. And some platforms like Moodle allow you to create group assessments that students can complete. And then the students submit a group assessment rather than one that's individual. Now, the problem with that, of course, if you're dealing with an environment such as the one that I'm in presently, where you're required to make an individual assessment of students, how do you actually attribute the effort of the individual in the group? How do you assign that grade? Do you assign a grade to an individual based on the same grade for the group? Or is there a method that you can employ to actually work out the contribution of each member? But I find that those functions within LMS systems that we use here, and Moodle is one of them, that lend themselves towards creating group type assessments where group is assessed, not the individual, work particularly well and are quite appreciated by the students. Lastly, synchronous communication. WeChat has some very rudimentary synchronous communication tools. There are others, such as Zoom, for example. And Zoom now has an offering that's solely based in China, I think. But there are other tools as well that are offered here that are used increasingly to facilitate distance learning education, for example, between campuses that may be quite apart in terms of distance. So they're becoming more prevalent as well. But still, at the core is the classroom model where the teacher's in the centre and the learners take a more passive role. I'd like to make out of all of this. Well, I came up with this diagram and I wasn't exactly sure what to call it. But essentially, I think that when we're looking at how to design our courses in LMSs and how we actually use the LMS to teach our students, there are three main dimensions to keep in mind. One of them is culture, one of them is technology penetration, and the last one, teaching methods. Now, when I talk about culture, I'm not referring to the ethnic or national origins of students, rather the degree to which students tend to work together as a group or engage in groupthink, and the degree to which students tend to work as individuals. Now, I think the difference here between a country like China, which is more monocultural in terms of its ethnic makeup, is that people have a pre-selection to work in groups. Whereas in Australia, we promote the idea that an individual is responsible for their education. So when we're considering how to design a course, for example, whether an assessment item should be individually based or whether it should be targeting group effort, then looking at the profile of our learners could help us decide what sort of elements we should put into that assessment. The second one is technology penetration. Now, in terms of technology usage and I guess, familiarity from a learner point of view, I would have to say that both are on the high end in China and Australia. Not too much difference there. But you could have cohorts of students, for example, in different demographics that don't have a great deal of familiarity with LMS systems, how they're used, or technology in general. So we have an expectation in Australia, for example, that most students will be familiar with social media tools such as Facebook and Twitter, and that learning how to use an LMS interface really only takes, half an hour worth of effort, and the student can get stuck into the course material and then ploughing through gaining the competencies they need to gain their qualification. But we can't always assume that. And so another consideration in course design and delivery is the degree of acceptance and degree of understanding of technology that students have. And if there is a barrier to actually understanding how the LMS can work, if there is a barrier of understanding of where the resources can be easily found within the LMS space, then that's going to impede the progress of the student. And so we can't really make an assumption, for example, that someone, I think, is 22 or 23, and that they actually are familiar with how technology works, and then we can simply expose them to an LMS system and expect them to work seamlessly within that environment. It's an important consideration to remember. And the last one here, and the one that particularly gives me a lot of issues, is teaching methods. Should we be teacher-centered, or should we take a student-centered approach? Personally, I don't think one is advantageous over the other. There's some evidence to suggest that in Australia we've gone overboard with the flipped classroom student-centered approach, where we put the student in command and then we facilitate. There is something to be said about a well-organised class that is controlled by one person at the front of a group of learners, which is still very much the norm in China. So the challenge here is, if we're teaching in the vet space in Australia, is it appropriate to take a student-centered approach if we're dealing with separate cohorts of students, some that might be from China, which is the largest group of any international student group in Australia, and then we're dealing with international students, Australian students, for example, that are used to being self-directed. How do we deal with that situation? How do we structure our assessments so that both cohorts of learners have an equal chance of success? It's a particularly large challenge. I have to fight that challenge every day here because I'm working in an environment where I'm expected to deliver Australian education, which is individually focused in very much a groupthink environment, or an environment where group learning is the favoured method by students within the country. So I think the main takeaway from this that I'd like to share with you is how we design our courses, how we design the delivery structure using LMSs very much depends upon the sort of students we have, groupthink, individual, technology penetration, how accustomed and used they are to the technology we expect them to use, and teaching methods. Should we be teacher-centered or should we be student-centered? Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentation, and I'm sorry I can't be with you. See you next time.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much, Joe and Ritesh. So, yes, you've shared your screen, Ritesh. That's great. We're all here. I'd just like you to wave in thanks to our speakers that we've had in these 4 very excellent talks today. Thank you very much for the time and the effort that you put into it. Certainly, there's quite some, I've taken some notes, there's quite some room for thoughts. And I'm going to open up for questions now. And I probably need to say that these sessions are being recorded. So, if you've missed out on one or some of the others that you haven't attended to in some of the other streams, then you'll be sent a link and you can go back and have a look at those in time. So that's great. We need to sort of, finish up at fairly, in the next 10 minutes or so people can get a cup of coffee and so on and so forth and be ready for the 3 o'clock sessions. So I'm mindful of that, but there's probably some room for questions if people have. So if you'd like to unmute your microphone to ask a question, go ahead. while that's happening, Kate, I wonder if you would reflect. We heard in the last talk the difference between cultures. It seems to me that the work that you've been involved in is being the other end of the scale. It's sort of like an extreme version of students taking their responsibility. Would you like to comment on how you found that process?
Yeah, that's been a really interesting one for us. It's particularly students. We know students' self-reporting can often be a little bit problematic. You know, students either over or under assess themselves and their abilities, generally speaking. You know, we've got a lot of research on that. The idea that students think that they're going to be independent and able to work independently, and they want that, but then they get in there and then they actually find that they really want more than they think, or actually vice versa. So the design of the course that we've done aims to cater for that distance ed student. For anybody who works in distance ed, you have those distance ed students who float around the edges, who don't engage, or they do engage actually, they just don't engage with you or their peers, but they do quite well. They actually engage with the material. So they're very, very, very self-regulated. So we designed the course for those students. What we found was we had a lot of other students who might have come in because it was cheap and they wanted to get an MBA. So actually dealing with that student cohort has probably been one of our biggest challenges, and creating a sense of community outside what students understand to be a normal sense of community. That's been our biggest challenge.
Okay, thank you very much for that reflection. You know, nothing's perfect, is it? It's all about holding things in happy tension, as we call it. So is there any other question out there for any of our presenters?
While Kate's got the talking stick, I might ask her a question. I wonder, Kate, you've been doing this for a little while now. I mean, you're talking about those students, and I wonder how many of those students are sort of stuck in the messy middle. I certainly couldn't do this thing that has no deadlines, that sort of just says, as long as you get it in 5 years, you're laughing. Off you go. So I guess my question is, do you have students that you think are stuck in that mucky middle, that started strong and have kind of got a bit stuck, and maybe will kind of come a bit unstuck once they realise that they've got a year to go? And how much scaffolding do you do for the students around sort of setting some of their own timetable and their own plan, or is that really about the right students being in the unit that are able to cope with that?
Yeah, no, we did design a course support model with it in mind. So we gave them a nominal amount of hours that we thought would be consistent with their normal study. The amount of time that so Kate can talk to Michael on a one-on-one basis to support your study. So we came up with a nominal figure there. We find that students are very aware of that. But actually our first graduate, if she does in fact graduate, is the first student who wanted to pull out. So she wanted to pull out, thought it was all too hard, really difficult. But our course manager engaged with her. She now keeps track of her hours. So she knows that she's got this many hours that she can engage with us as part of the overall study approach. And so she, for example, will ring up just before an assessment, talk through the assessment, and then submit it. So, you know, things like submission phobia, we've identified submission phobia. We've identified things like students reflecting over and over. They go back and back and back over their material. We don't see that in normal study because students are actually forced to not engage. So when you're on a 12-week track, you're just kind of working to your 12-week or your 6-week track, as Ray was talking about earlier. Whereas our students, we see that they might revise something 20, 30, 40 times before they actually then submit. That's very unusual for us. So yeah, so there's a little bit of in between, but we're pretty happy with our support model. You know, there are some students we have to orient to. There are other students who are very, very self-regulated.
Great, thanks, Kate. That's a great response. And can I remind people that this session, when it ends, you'll need to re-log back in through the website for the particular Zoom rooms for the 3 o'clock session. So just remember that. And of course, there in the website, its.cqu.edu.au conf that you've got in your emails. So just prepare to log in again at 3 o'clock. So I'm happy to stay around and steer some more questions. Anything else for some of our other presenters at all?
Ritesh and I are happy to answer questions about Darren's talk if anyone wants to ask a question about that. And thank you for the comments that are there. I'm going to save the comments and send them to him.
Yeah, there's quite a few there, isn't there, Joe? I mean, one of the questions I would have is some of the differences that they use for engagement, but that's perhaps for a longer time. I wouldn't mind seeing some notes that Darren has formulated, which is their more cultural experience for engaging students to learn from. So that's a longer exercise, but I wouldn't mind that as resource down the track. Any other questions for the presenters?
Just because a couple of people made comments about the technology, it's not just that China has blocked Zoom and a couple of other things that every week we try a different technology to when we have our meeting, every fortnight with our meetings with him, but also the university has also blocked him from some ways of uploading material as well, because they see, because you know how China has was it ANU last year, they stole some data, so CQU was also blocking sites.
Allegedly.
Oh, sorry, allegedly, someone from China stole information from ANU. So CQU are also doing some blocking as well. So yeah, Darren's finding it quite stressful. And that's why, as you'll see in the video, he looked really, really tired, I thought.
All right, friends. Well, I get the sense that people need their cup of tea or cup of coffee. So I bid you adieu and be prepared to log in again for 3 o'clock session for some great new other talks. So thank you very much for everybody's time.